Welcome to the 29th Miami Jewish Film Festival, the largest Jewish film festival in the world. We thank you, all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, as well as the film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, SAGE, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all these years. My name is Carly Orshan. And I work at SAGE and run a Holocaust education programming there. And I'm excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with director Thom Vander Beken and hear more about the premiering of this year's this festival and how the last year's summer is going to play into the festival. Thank you all for joining us today. So, Thom, I'm really excited to dive into the last Jewish summer because I think it really shapes a pivotal and somewhat painful moment in Antwerp's history. In 1942, when we see and your retelling of what happened to the Jewish residents in that local space and what happened with the collaborators and perpetrators and all the dynamics. And to begin, I'd like to understand, what compelled you to tell this story and why now? Why does it feel like the right moment to be sharing this now?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and thank you for showing the film in Miami. Um, the reason why you start a film project as a director, I mean, there's always a few things that come together, right? One of the big things was a book that was published a few years ago, which was called 1942, The Year of Silence. It was written by one of the biggest historians that we have in Belgium, and he worked on it for 14 years. And he went through all the police files day by day, trying to see, okay, what happened and how did this progress in 1942? How did the Germans manage to get so many people involved and so many people to participate and so many people to look away from what was happening. Um, a friend of mine who's a fiction director, he had the idea to make a fiction film. And so people asked me if I wanted to do the documentary part. Um, for fiction, you can rely on actors. For documentary, of course, you need to find real characters. So, yeah, it was the beginning of a 4 year long process to turn this book into a film. Um, and if you ask me why now, well, unfortunately, most of the survivors who were there in the summer of 1942 are disappearing. And I think this will, change our relationship to history. We can no longer sit across from the people who experienced it and who can share their personal emotional stories. So it was a rhetorical question that I asked myself. Is it still important to remember the Holocaust? It's rhetorical because the answer is yes. But why is it important? And I think that's also what I try to answer throughout the film. Why is it still relevant for us today? And to cut all the way back to the ending of the film, well, today we still remain silent. We still turn away from injustices happening. And sometimes you wonder, have we learned anything at all? Right? So, yeah.
I think that, I agree completely. And one of the things that we do is how do we retell these stories, especially with survivors that have that firsthand knowledge. I think you did such a great job of doing that through this cinematic way. But I think you're speaking to one of the biggest issues in society and like the core theme of silence. Silence within families and institutions and in generations later on. And then what's going on even in these young people's lives today that they are just saying, like, I'm uncomfortable and yet I'm silent about it in a way. Like, even just like the hesitance of how one of the young girls was like sharing about like her what it feels like to be an immigrant in Belgium, right? Like that to me, there was like silence in those gaps and in those spaces. And so as a director, how do you really conceptualize that silence as a narrative force? How do you bring those, how do you feel like you were able to bring those things to the screen in such a frontal way throughout this film?
As a director, there's a lot of things that you do without maybe realizing it. I met or I've been talking to all the protagonists in the film over a period of 4 years. So you get to know each other really well. You build a lot of trust. And yeah, you sometimes feel, sometimes intuitively, but sometimes the protagonists also really say it out loud what their weak points are and what they struggle with. And one thing that was obvious right from the beginning for many of them was, we don't talk about anything at home, right? And I mean, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Belgian culture. I mean, I can tell you it's very different from American culture. We are not big talkers. If you ask a Belgian, how are you doing? He or she will most likely answer, and that
That's
means yes,
it.
no, fill in what you want, and right. So you can imagine when something as traumatic as the Holocaust happened, that the silence in the generations after the war must have been killing, right? And when I was talking to the pupils in the school, who all have migration backgrounds, and who all knew very little about the Holocaust and about what had happened in Belgium or Europe during the war years. But they all had a very similar family story. When something traumatic had happened, they never talked about it at home. So, this girl from Afghanistan who opens the film, I mean, you see in all her reactions how emotionally involved she is. Uh, and yeah, nobody talks to her. They never discuss it at the dinner table so I could also notice when I brought the pupils together with the protagonists, that was something that they could very easily bond around or about. Um, so yeah, and visually, how I wanted to shape that into the film was, of course, to work with a set, which is set literally in, yeah, a big black empty space. It's a space that you try to fill with a story, but it's a story that you try to piece together with bits and pieces that come from different sources and that sometimes are not overlapping or yeah.
Yeah, there's so much I want to touch on from what you just said. So we're going to jump around a little bit. But speaking of the visual language of the film, like it's really remarkable, I think, how you wove that in, right? That stylized 1940s interior from that like black space, right? And constructed that memory space, giving the audience a chance to kind of imagine in a different way, but then also kind of having that meta cinematic approach of like zooming out. And what kind of, I guess as a director, I'm assuming you think about, and I could be wrong, but like what kind of like emotions or hopes or ideas were you trying to invoke, for the audience to see and to feel within that cinematic language?
Yeah. As part of the research, I was looking at a lot of other documentaries about the war and about the Holocaust, and very often we get historians who sit in front of the camera who explain why, how, yeah, right. It's a voice of authority who says, "Look, this is what happened," and I thought that's very interesting, but I'm more interested in, second and third generation. What do they know, or what is it that they don't know? And starting from that, how can these stories and reenacting them trigger reactions in their head and in their hearts. Because I needed something to show. I mean, unfortunately, there is not so much archive footage from the war years in Belgium. There is much more from Germany, the Netherlands, France. And Belgium ran out of film stock, it seems, during the war. So there is literally not so much. Um, and so this could help me to avoid using too much archive. But it was also a way to, yeah, get everybody involved because the pupils helped during the reenactions of these family stories. So they witnessed what happened or had happened. And so it made it also easier for them then to reflect on why is this relevant to me? What can I say about it? Like, there's one girl who takes part in one of the razzias around the house. And she literally says, like, in the beginning, it was an acting job. I was walking around, wearing a flashlight. But then all of a sudden it hit me. Wow, how how incredibly hard it must have been for those people who were hiding inside. And that's what I was trying to get to, by reenacting these scenes, making it easier for everybody to, yeah, talk about it. Because put somebody in front of the camera and ask him or her, how do you feel about, what happened during the war? I mean, it's a lot more difficult because the distance is so big. But when you've just reenacted your family story, it makes it a bit easier, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting way to be thinking about these narratives for the Holocaust and what we in the work that we do at Sage. We run some programs that take students to Poland to learn about the history and to learn about their history, Jewish teens. And one of the things that we try to empower them to do is to share family testimony or to share, if they don't have family testimony, to share somebody else's voice, right? And I think that that's like so well done in this film of like taking and embodying, someone else's voice and being the voice for those people that no longer can have that voice or, in the future will not have that, and I think that this is a unique way, in thinking of cinematography and the generations to come of what this narrative looks like in the future. How does that portray? And I think that you've done a really excellent job of doing that. And it's a great model to be thinking about a very nuanced and complicated piece of our history that we want to, keep and hold on to. So I really thank you for that. And I think it was a really refreshing and unique way of looking at that. I want to ask a little bit about the intergenerational structure that you had, having those different descendants of survivors, collaborators, and today's students, and kind of like the emotional and also like ethical complexity of that. Because I feel like there's like a lot of, you mentioned like you get to know them over those 4 years, but there's definitely like a sensitivity to that. And, how did you kind of guide yourself to bringing these groups on the screen together? And what were some of the challenges that you had to navigate in doing that?
Yeah. So I actually started searching for three different groups of protagonists at the same time. For the pupils, I went to a school in Antwerp, which was the biggest school during the war. Also, the school with the highest number of Jewish pupils. It was very easy to gain access there because I'd already spoken to some of the teachers before for different projects that didn't work out. So, but we knew each other, and then they were very happy to participate in this. Um, and then Jewish families and the collaborators, everybody told me it would be extremely difficult to find Jewish protagonists because, they don't want to talk about this. And uh, completely the opposite. I found it very easy to get access to, yeah, Jewish people who were willing to share, I mean, yeah, these horrible stories from their families, right? I could really sense, and I mean, I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, but you could really sense that a lot of them feel such a big need to be able to testify about this, to be able to talk about this, because I think a lot of them still have the feeling that the stories have not been heard enough. And I guess somewhere in the background, it also plays a role that they are afraid that now that the last survivors are disappearing, that the attention for and the knowledge about the Holocaust will also fade away. So I think every one of the protagonists had a different motivation to take part in the film, but I think this probably played a part in also most of the motivations. Um, and then the group of the collaborators, it was extremely difficult to find people. Um, you call around, and at some point, I kid you not, I had a list of 20 or 30 names and phone numbers or email addresses of families who had a member in the family that had done something wrong during the war. I would call these people, I would try to be as delicate and careful as possible. And they would, most of them reply the same way. No, nothing wrong in our family during the war years. Okay, well, I have five other people who tell me differently, but, to cut a long story short, in the end, I managed to find a few people, and at the same time, I was also going through all the archives myself to see if I could find names that rang a bell or that would lead me into a different direction. Because what I really wanted to do, and that's what you can see in the film, is to connect all the stories. Because very quickly you realize that, any place where Jews lived before the war, they were part of the city fabric that existed, right? It's not like they all lived separated from everybody else. They went to work, they went to school, they interacted with non-Jews, So, and especially in Antwerp, this was, um, yeah, everybody knew each other. And for me, it was very important to get this aspect in there because, as you can also see in the film, people who knew each other would turn on each other, would write notes. I mean, it's almost insane to say this or to think about this, but that's what they did. And so that's how I tried to slowly piece these three groups together, find the right pupils to match with the right protagonists from the Jewish side and the collaborator side. I also wanted to make sure that I had a police officer, that I had a real Jew hunter, that I had someone who, yeah, was a bit of everything. So, yeah, that's part of the reason why it took so long to find the right connections between everybody.
Yeah. And and in the end, I assume that they were, the people involved were receptive to, speaking truth, right? And that authenticity of what really needs to be shared out. But I can only assume that, the struggle to go through that and the calls of making to all of those people. And I think, one of the things that you mentioned and is obviously evident in the film is the interweaving of the stories, and I think it weaves in some of the contemporary challenges, the issues in our world around anti-Semitism or just hate in general, and issues of collective responsibility, and all of those like layers, and is if there was like an urgency that you wanted to like share with the audience that you think is important during this social and political climate, what is that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We all live in bubbles, and we surround ourselves with people who think exactly like us. If we come across people who think very differently about certain topics, we push them out of our bubble, we unfriend them, we unfollow them, right? And in the film, you have so many different voices that, yeah, don't agree on much, right? And especially not like the collaborator side and the Jewish side. Um, but I thought, who am I to judge? Because maybe during the war, I would also have turned on someone, but I wanted to let them tell their story. They knew exactly what I thought about what they said. For example, the police officer who kept repeating that his grandfather had to obey the order because if you're part of the police force, that's basically what you had to do. He knew that I thought this was completely ridiculous. Um, but I told him, look, I respect what you think about it. I just want to tell you that in the film, you will be surrounded by voices who will say very different things. But I want to make sure that how your voice is portrayed in the film is exactly like you want it. And I think for me, this was also an interesting lesson in um, you can always learn something from listening to people with a different opinion. I mean, it's easy for me to talk, of course. I mean, it's not my family that was dragged out of the house and onto a truck. So, I mean, there are nuances there to how far you can go into listening to dissenting opinions. But in this film, I thought it was interesting and important to include these different opinions because if somebody who thinks very differently about the Holocaust watches this film, I want them to be able to, by hearing different opinions, to form their own opinion and maybe change their opinion. Because, as you see, the last person who gets to speak is Yael, and she makes the final point by saying, look, it's completely BS that you have to follow orders because she's sitting on that chair in 2023 because somebody decided to not obey the orders. And that's an important lesson to keep in mind. Um, but for me as a director, yeah, it was very interesting to work with these people and to listen to them and to, I think, staying respectful and staying open to engage with them was, yeah, I learned so much from that.
That's my last and final question, a little bit of like what what were you left with? And like, every director has, I'm sure, so many moments that kind of stay with them and like moments of learning and it sounds like there's so much complexity and emotional resonance of the interactions with the protagonist. So in the filmmaking process, what did you find yourself kind of returning to, or something that shaped you that you keep thinking about that kind of lasted, for this project that you've held on to?
It was really a roller coaster during the shooting of the film, and I realized that the year after it, I was still processing things. I would literally sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and hear parts of the dialogue in my head and think about it and reflect about it. And it was a very long editing process to put all the bits and pieces together and to let them interact with each other. So I think when I watch the film now, I keep seeing different things and I keep getting different ideas. And of course, it also interacts with the world we live in today. Um, and so as the world changes, I see things in the film that also, yeah, make me think differently. But it's a little bit scary at the same time that what this girl from Afghanistan says at the ending of the film. She's Belgian, she lives there. I mean, she's studying to be a doctor now, but still, somehow, she doesn't feel fully accepted. And in the 1940s, only 10% of the Jews who lived in Antwerp had Belgian nationality. The other 90% had not Belgian identity. So, in a way, we relive the same situation where people who we decide are outsiders are not accepted. And it's just, yeah, we throw away so much potential and so many talents. And for what, you wonder, right? I mean, I have no idea for what, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think this film really hits on so many of the themes of what's going on in our world today, and the othering of each other, the the need to kind of burst those bubbles and those pockets in which we live in. And it was such a privilege to be able to watch it and to get this lens that you've created. Before we conclude, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audiences about the film and your process as a director in it?
Well, maybe to end on a happy note,
Yeah.
after the film, there was somebody who came towards me and she said, "You know what? After watching your film, I realized that we need to talk more about what happened in our families." And this was a non-Jewish person, but she said, "I really need to sit down with my daughters and to tell them where they come from and what their grandparents shared with me when I was younger, and where certain other family members, come from." And I thought, maybe if that could be the positive message of the film, is that we need to talk a lot more about these stories in our lives that really changed us, sometimes in a good and a bad way. But yeah, as Peggy says in the film, the more we know of each other, what we have in our little backpack, the more we see each other as human. And I think that's what's lacking sometimes, that we see each other as human instead of the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And it breaks that silence that we spoke about in such a meaningful way. There's an idea in Judaism that it's called B'Tselem Elohim. We're all created in the image of God. And when we can look at each other in a way that is recognizing that we are the same, we have different experiences, but we are all created through this image. It's supposed to kind of break down those barriers and those walls, and to really kind of see people for who they are. And I think that it's wonderful if that's the takeaway that the audience can get from this film. And I certainly hope that they do. So I want to thank you so much for your time, and certainly for this film into the canon of the world and what it can create for the future. The Last Jewish Summer is really such an exceptional piece for us to be thinking about memory and how we preserve that as we move ahead. So once again, I want to thank all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsor, SAGE, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, for their continued support for all these years. And a special thank you to you in joining us in this conversation, and for everyone for joining the 29th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival.